On today's World Insight, crucial security talks between Russia and US-led NATO in Brussels amid tensions over Ukraine. Enough room for compromise? What's on the agenda? Here is our host, Tian Wei.
Hello and welcome to World Insight. I'm Tian Wei. Our program is live from Beijing. In Brussels, many expect Russia have been expecting to spell out demands for security guarantees in a meeting with NATO. The meeting follows intense talks between Kremlin and Washington in Geneva that show the two sides have to bridge major differences. Russia has deployed thousands of troops near the border with Ukraine, which Washington says is a prelude to an invasion. But Russia rules out such plans. So what's really going on? Before we loop in the panelists from different parts of the world, let's take a look at this.
On Monday, representatives from Russia and the U.S. met in Geneva. Russian Deputy Foreign Minister Sergei Ryabkov sat down in a meeting with U.S. Deputy Secretary of State Wendy Sherman. The meeting focused on bilateral relations and the security situation in Ukraine. No apparent breakthrough after the 8-hour talks, but it was a chance to hear each other out.
And the idea was for the United States and, in our hope, the Russian Federation to come with viable, practical, reciprocal ideas, to put those on the table, and to see if there were the potential for progress. We did not intend this to be a forum where certainly decisions were reached, where any breakthroughs could be achieved or really even contemplated.
For his part, Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov said Tuesday the manner in which the talks were held, open, comprehensive, and direct, deserves a positive assessment, but it's the result that matters. Moscow insisted on guarantees to halt NATO's eastward expansion, seeing a Ukraine NATO membership as a direct threat to its security. Russian President Vladimir Putin said that is a red line. Russia also denied Western accusations that it plans to invade Ukraine with a military buildup near the border. However, the U.S. said Russia's demands are a non-starter. Sherman said the U.S. would not allow anyone to slam shut NATO's open-door policy. Talks between Russia and NATO will be held on Wednesday in Brussels, followed by a meeting in Vienna of the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe on Thursday. Pretty crucial talks going this week. Is there room for compromise or too many irreconcilable differences?
For insights on the latest relations between Russia and the West, let's turn to our panelists in Moscow. Pavel Felgenhauer, Russian political and defense analyst. In Boston, Jim Walsh, Senior Research Associate at MIT's Security Studies Program. In Chapel Hill, the U.S., Klaus Larries, Distinguished Professor of History and International Affairs from University of North Carolina. And in Shanghai, Shending Li, Professor of the Institute of International Studies with Fudan University. Gentlemen, welcome to the program. One could tell we have guests from different perspectives, the U.S., Russia, and certainly also from China. Now, one of the things very important is 3 rounds of talks laid out throughout the week. Are we going to expect much? Mr. Felgenhauer from Russia, briefly from you first, sir.
Well, there was the meeting in Geneva. The sides more or less agreed to disagree, but there will be continuation. There's going to be a memorandum presented by the Americans as a result of their discussions already in Washington, and then maybe there'll be a summit between Putin and Biden, though maybe virtually, but still. Russia believes that only in bilateral talks any progress can happen. There is today a meeting in Brussels, but that will be 30 NATO members having already a fixed position, talking to Russia with also having a fixed position. No real progress happening there. And in Vienna, there'll be even more countries present. Again, hardly in one day there could be any kind of progress. Yeah. But there will be, next week, there'll be more between Russia and America.
Mr. Walsh, can we expect 3 layers of talks, certainly well planned, But will there be good results?
Well, I would say this, as long as they're talking, they're probably not going to start fighting. Sometimes that happens, but I would not expect that in this case. So that's a win, right? So they're talking about things they disagree with. The other thing I would point out is it's not like there's some external event that's pushing Putin where he has to decide tomorrow or next week or some date in the calendar. Nothing is forcing his hand with respect to crossing further into Ukrainian territory. So we have a situation where both parties have the time and luxury to talk about this rather than resort to armed struggle. And then, of course, we're in the middle of a pandemic, so that may give the parties pause.
All right, let's take a look at some of the details. That is likely to be the center of focus, because we do not know much about exactly what's happening during those two earlier rounds of talks, and it's hard to predict what's likely to happen for the third round. But let's take a look at some of the widely publicized points of disagreement. For example, Professor Laris, whether NATO would agree with the further expansion or the limits of expansion, and whether NATO would establish military bases, particularly the U.S., in countries and territories that were used to be part of the former Soviet Union. Professor Laris, how do you see that point is likely to be handled by both sides?
Yeah, it is good that both sides are talking, but some of the demands which Russia has made are unacceptable to NATO and to the United States. So it cannot be that Russia decides whether or not NATO is allowed to expand or whether or not new members can be admitted. It is, of course, on the other hand, quite understandable that Russia doesn't want to see Georgia and Ukraine, for example, join NATO, but it cannot have a veto right over that. So some sort of compromise needs to be found. That will not be a compromise which will be put down in a clear treaty and clear guarantees as Moscow has demanded, but perhaps some informal assurances can be given, because NATO of course has no intention to invade Russia, and NATO doesn't actually want to give membership to Ukraine and Georgia, certainly not at this point. And so it's a bit of an artificial crisis. Putin is getting worked up about something which is actually not about to happen. However, the 100,000 troops he has based in Ukraine at the border, in Russia at the border with Ukraine. These are, of course, very real facts on the ground. And here some de-escalation needs to take place as well.
Informal reassurances, that seems to be a very interesting combination of phrase. Professor Laris, what are you trying to refer to? Do you think there is trust between Moscow and Washington, or let's just say some of the major NATO capitals that would support these informal reassurances to Russia if that really happened?
Yes, I believe so, because there is no readiness to have Ukraine and Georgia join NATO. Everyone knows that. Putin knows that. He knows that NATO is not about to offer membership again to Georgia and Ukraine. So, but NATO is not prepared to give formal guarantees, because it would hand a veto right to Russia, which of course is not acceptable to the Western world. So somewhere in the middle, assurances need to be sufficient. So Putin has said he wants a formal treaty, and that he will never get. So he has to compromise. Concessions have to be found. And I think that both sides are talking. That means trust can be built up. And there are other possibilities where trust can be found. For example, about intermediate range missiles, about transparency, about communication, but also, of course, regarding cyber attacks, and cyber warfare. That should be addressed as well.
So, Mr. Falkenhauer, it seems that the other two guests, Mr. Walsh and Professor Laris, based in the U.S., are suggesting Russia is asking for something that would never be able to be achieved. However, Russia knows already the informal reassurances, and Russia, in fact, is not asking for real shall I say, real compromises coming from NATO, but rather these are just some of those topics, surfacing for media's consumption, while other topics probably is even more important. Is that also your assessment?
Well, the Russian official position is quite different. Russia demands from the West legal assurances, and actually demands that the West withdraw some of its installations and forces, it had moved closer to Russian borders. And Russia is saying that you should do that, or we will take counteraction. The form of this counteraction has not been spelled out, but apparently what right now the Kremlin today is saying is that these would be threats. It's not that Russia is invading Ukraine at present, at least that's the Russian official position. We have no intention, though, as it has been said, that maybe Ukraine will attack or do some kind of act of aggression. But so Russia may install some weapons that could be threatening to Western countries, European and American citizens, and then maybe the West will think again.
Interesting. Mr. Falkenhauer, may I just follow up very briefly? There were earlier suggestions that Russia has been, since 1989, believing, many in Russia at least, that Russia was tricked at the time when the Cold War ended by the West, quote unquote. And there is, as a result of that, a continuous lack of genuine trust between Russia and the West. So with that in the middle, do you think there's anything in concrete that's likely to happen for these 3 rounds of talks?
Yes, the Russian leadership believes they were tricked, actually, not only in the 90s, but in the beginning of the 2000s, when Putin came to power in Moscow. He was pressing for very closer relations with the West and the United States. That didn't happen. It was believed that the West was pushing into Russian influence, what Russia believes is essential interests. And so right now, there's a bitter feeling, and Russia demands that the West redo what it did wrong before.
Very interesting situation. Therefore, I want to go to Professor Shending Li from China. You've been attentively listening to your fellow panelists. Now, China, of course, is not in these talks. This is mainly Russia and the West. However, there are a lot of things that's happening. For example, what is the U.S. having in mind in terms of its key competitors or strategic competitors? And also look at what is happening in China's neighborhood, Kazakhstan, for example. Now, we know that the situation is coming down there, but there are a lot of moving factors, not to mention the geopolitical tensions that's going on in the world. So, Professor Shen, how is China looking and digesting all of these things going on right now between Russia and, quote-unquote, the West, the 3 rounds of talks?
Okay, the following is my personal view. First, we should respect countries like Ukraine and Kazakhstan. And they are sovereign country. Their integrity, sovereignty, and security should be respected. This is the first principle. In this vein, Ukraine has a right to choose side. When it feels somehow insecure, it can seek the UN or some other country or grouping of countries for its security. Therefore, Ukraine does have a right to work with US, NATO for its legitimate security. But meantime, Ukraine and its security partner should be careful not to present its force and intent in a way to be perceived by any other country, in this matter primarily Russia, as an illegitimate threat. Russia can view US NATO's force deployment through Ukraine's potential NATO membership as a greater threat. This is exactly, I would view this as a modern edition of Cuban Missile Crisis. Sovereign country Cuba has a right to seek Soviet Union for its defense support. But the presence of the Soviet nuclear-tipped missile so close to US could be viewed legitimately by the US as a threat. So the US would demand Soviet Union not to do it. And eventually, Soviet Union withdrew. And that dissolved the Cuban Missile Crisis. So in the same way, Ukraine feels certain threat, possibly from Russia. and Ukraine can seek help from other countries.
Wow.
But don't do in a way that would be perceived by Russia as an illegitimate threat. In this way, the talks currently between NATO and Russia is crucial. So they have not made major headway, but the process of talk to understand the vast difference and potentially to narrow the difference step by step is very important. So we need to respect Ukraine. We also need to respect Kazakhstan. When it feels internal turmoil, it has a right to seek external support from Russia to help it to stabilize its sovereignty and stability.
Well, we're going to continue our discussions about these fascinating topics. Certainly, the 3 rounds of talks taking place recently with Russia and the West going to bring a lot of interesting information and a lot of nuance to all the situations that we have been mentioning. Thank you so much, gentlemen. Stay with us. You're watching World Insight. We'll be back after this. This is the World Insight with me, Tian Wei. We are now joined by 4 panelists from different parts of the world. Mr. Felgenhauer in Moscow, Professor Walsh from MIT in Boston, Professor Laris from University of North Carolina in the U.S., and Professor Shen from Fudan University. Let's continue our discussion, gentlemen. Fascinating topic with the 3 rounds of discussions between Russia and also the West. And now the one with NATO just wrapped up. We are looking forward to see some more information coming out. While we are doing that, Mr. Felgenhauer from Russia, I want to ask, on the other areas besides just the Ukraine issue, there seems to be a lot of space for discussion between Russia and the West, with NATO particularly. What do you think could be some of the groundwork that can be laid this time with this round?
Well, Russia has put out very specific demands. It believes that NATO forces should withdraw to the positions they held before 97. Especially Russia is unhappy with anti-missile batteries that Aegis ashore that were deployed in Romania and being redeployed in Poland. And Moscow says, and President Putin said, that these batteries can be used for launching offensive missiles at Moscow or other Russian important positions. That should be withdrawn. NATO should kind of pull back its military infrastructure and stop trying to move further to Russian borders and stop to kind of unofficially install new weapons, say, in Ukraine.
Mr. Walsh, much can be achieved. You've been working on non-proliferations for long.
Yeah, I think a lot can be accomplished. But let me first say, Wei, that I think if you assemble this group of panelists in Geneva or Brussels, we can solve this problem because I'm in broad agreement with them. I agree that Ukraine joining NATO is a bad idea. I agree that Russia would feel threatened by that. I agree that NATO doesn't want Ukraine to join NATO. And so there's a lot of space here in diplomacy to sort of make promises, and both sides have leverage, right? The Russians can always amass more troops on the border if it gets angry, and the other side can always threaten its sanctions or the other stuff. So this is a solvable problem, and I think my colleagues and I, together with you, your leadership, Wei, that we can solve this. But on the non-proliferation issue, yes. I mean, right now the non-proliferation regime is fraying. We have setbacks in arms control and disarmament. The NPT conference, review conference, was supposed to be scheduled for this year, but under difficult circumstances. So there's a lot that needs repair, and that repair should begin with the U.S. and Russia.
Professor Laris, you can tell that Mr. Walsh resents the fact that he is not being invited either in Geneva or, or in Vienna. But tell me more about how much do you think these critical issues, besides just Ukraine, could really be laid foundation on by these round of talks, given the different geopolitical needs coming from both sides?
I like the idea that Jim Walsh and I will solve the problems in Geneva. That's a very good idea.
Don't forget to invite your Russian counterpart, Mr.
Russian...
Felgenhauer, and the Chinese counterpart as well. But anyway,
absolutely,
go ahead.
Absolutely, all of us. But I think the Russian idea of going back to 1997, that was 2 years before Putin ever came into office, this is really quite unrealistic. You know, no country, no alliance in the world will go back and forget the last 20 years. So I think, and Putin knows that is unrealistic. We also have to keep in mind that NATO is not forcing anyone to become a member. You know, countries like the Baltic states in the early 2000s or before that, Poland and the Czech Republic, they were so desperate to join NATO because they felt threatened and intimidated by Russia. And I think that is what we need to bear in mind. Also look at Ukraine. Ukraine was actually very pro-Russia until 2014. After 2014 and the annexation of Crimea,
I'm asking more about exactly what are some of the rather non-proliferation and strategic issues that can be laid foundation on, not necessarily on the Ukraine issue. Can you be a little bit more specific on that briefly?
Yes. Absolutely. The issue of intermediate range missiles can be resolved. Both sides can come to a compromise not to deploy certain missiles. Also maneuvers and deployments of temporary forces can be resolved. As I said before, cyber warfare, cyber attacks can be resolved. There are a wide range of possibilities where confidence building measures between NATO and the United States and Russia can be built up. And I think that should be tackled first, and then, you know, the Ukraine problem can also be tackled. But what is important, I think, is that a de-escalation of the situation is taking place at the same time. And I would say that Putin doesn't want to keep 100,000 troops and more on the border with Ukraine for many more months. What's the point of that? It's very costly.
All right, Mr. Felgenhauer, I think it's only...
while these confidence relations.
I think we could not read exactly the minds of the leaders coming from various countries, but we could tell is what these talks actually could achieve. Mr. Felgenhauer, do you agree with your two American counterparts? I think it's fair for you to respond a little bit before we go to Mr. Shen.
There have been some assurances, at least during the telephone talks between Putin and Biden, that America is not intending to deploy any attack weapons in Ukraine. Russia would also want to see American bombs of these double key bombs that are deployed in Europe to be withdrawn to American territory. Actually, the United States does not need those bombs very much because they're not intended for American planes, they're intended for Europeans. So there could be something agreed there. And that's what Russia is really striving for, to find some kind of agreement directly between Washington and Moscow, Putin and Biden, and bypass the very complicated issues of negotiating with big bodies like European Union, NATO, and that's not really very practical. So, and of course on missiles, not to deploy missiles that could be aimed at Moscow, American missiles that are being right now developed. Some agreements there could be achieved. The troops on the border is not that much of an economic issue for Russia. Russia, since 2015, has been deploying large numbers of troops on a permanent basis on the Ukrainian border, and those troops that are there right now, they're not massed. I mean, they're massed there for already several years.
I see.
And they're not going right now away. There were additional troops that could be moved in, and they have not yet been moved in. So the situation is not yet that dire that we're kind of going to war immediately, but they could appear there if the situation goes sideways.
One could tell both sides are trying to argue for further space in the discussion, even among the panelists like ours. But let me go to Mr. Shen. Once again, China is not a party of those talks. However, you know, there are two layers of things. One is the things that if Russia and the West could have a relatively better relations, particularly on the non-proliferation issue, it could be good news for everyone. However, on the other side, there's also the geopolitical balance that we are seeing that are evolving as we speak in the world, China, Russia, the United States, and the West, quote unquote. So how do you see, Mr. Shen, on these different layers, things should take place from China's perspective, and how will China read all these messages?
I only offer my personal view.
Sure.
I think U.S. and Russia are keen to work on regional and global strategic stability. And potentially they could discuss how to reinitiate INF. A new edition of intermediate range missile treaty, which would at least be applicable in European continent area. But that may not be applicable outside of Europe. That would give some leeway for the US and for Russia. They could work on how to manage the space stability, to have certain arms control for the testing of a hypersonic vehicle, which Russia is leading and the US is concerned. So in some area, US is concerned. Some other area, Russia is concerned. They may put a grand deal to stabilize their different kind of concern, and also to make China feel secure, not to make China feel insecure because they made some headway to improve their relationship. So this is a very important and a very interesting subject that would warrant China's best wish for them to reach a good outcome.
Right. Our time is so limited for a discussion as grand as this, but I want to thank all of you, gentlemen, for helping us to understand very different perspectives. These are important to understand our world is not just black and white. Shending Li, Klaus Laris, Jim Walsh, Pavel Felgenhauer, really appreciate that. All the best, gentlemen. That's all the time we have for today. If you'd like to know more, search World Insight. That's our program. Or check out our YouTube channel. Follow us on Twitter and Facebook. I'm Tian Wei. On behalf of my team, thanks for being with us, and bye for now.